Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So the series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, February 7th, 1820, 86 formerly enslaved people boarded a boat headed from New York to Freetown, Sierra Leone. This was the first trip sponsored by a private group, the American Colonization Society, that seek to help free slaves return to West Africa, namely to the region that would come to be known as the country of Liberia. Here to discuss the ACS, how it actually complicated the abolitionist movement here in the United States, and the Back to Africa movement in general, is, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Columbia. Hello, Niki.
Hello, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello, Kellie.
Hey there.
So, Kellie, you want to start by painting a picture of this moment, 86 people getting onto this boat. What do we know about them and what do we know about this trip?
So it's 86 people, men, women, and some children. And these are formerly freed slaves, many of them who were born in the United States, who have never lived in Africa before, let alone in Liberia. And they're making the long pilgrimage of what could be considered a reverse middle passage back to Africa. We know during this time it takes about 3 to 4 weeks, depending upon weather, to get back to the west coast of Africa. They leave during a pretty terrible time. It's February, it's winter, it's cold. We know that a lot of people on board the ship get sick. This is not the best time to travel, considering their conditions. But when they get to Liberia, I mean, a whole new world opens up for them. And it starts the story of more and more Africans making this pilgrimage, if you will, back to Africa.
And a really interesting story of colonization, because the experience is one that we're used to when we think about the colonization of what would become the United States. A lot of the people who arrived in Liberia over the first 20 years or so died. Like 2/3 of them died because the conditions were difficult. Building a society is pretty hard to do. And they were living in this colony that was owned by the American Colonization Society, which is a weird thing, this private colony in Africa.
Yeah. And you know, I think this image of it being a reverse middle passage, or I've heard this ship referred to as the Mayflower of Liberia, as you were hinting at, Niki. But the sponsor of this, the ACS, the American Colonization Society, Kellie, what do we know about this group? Why is it popping up, and what are its fundamental goals?
So we know that the ACS was founded in 1816 by Robert Finley, and he really had a mission of returning slaves to Africa.
And Robert Finley, a white man, right? We should say.
Oh, yes. Robert Finley is a white man. The mission, I should be clear, is not really abolition. This is not about, responding to the atrocities of slavery. But how do we deal with free Black people? A lot of Black Americans were not on board with the ACS. This was not their plan at all. So many Black Americans were just that, Americans. They had been born in the United States, and they were unwilling to leave the country of their birth for this unknown land. But it gets a lot of buy-in by Quakers in particular, and by white elites, even white slaveholders who don't really know how to deal with free Black people and believe that the presence of free Black people will run counter or conflict with their enslaved property.
This is such an important point, because it wasn't that this was a benevolent society that was trying to just do the best for these people. It was about cleansing the United States of free Black people. And that was how you were going to deal with slavery. There were some people in this group who wanted slavery to end. They just didn't want there to be any Black people left in the United States when that happened.
Yeah, that's why I always tell students there's a difference between being anti-slavery and an abolitionist. Like, you can be anti-slavery because you think the institution of slavery is wrong or you think it undercuts free labor. It doesn't mean that you're, like, pro-Black by any means. And those are two different categories, people who are anti-slavery and people who are abolitionists who wanted the overthrow of the institution of slavery.
Yeah. And there is also somewhere in here my sense that there's also this kind of like well-meaning liberal problem, right? Where, you know, as you were saying, Kellie, like, you know, maybe even people who were abolitionist or were anti-slavery, but, you know, had this notion of rather than confront the question of slavery and deal with the fact that these men and women are now Americans, you know, instead have this perhaps well-meaning idea of, well, we'll send them back to Africa, and in this sort of benevolent, patronizing way.
And the idea that they're Christianizing the continent,
Yes.
too. So there's a big sort of like, this is a little early for white man's burden, but the idea that we're bringing Christianity to this dark continent and that, you know, we're somehow saving souls in the process of doing this. People believe that this was the Lord's work.
Niki, can you talk a little bit more about the tensions between abolitionists and groups like the ACS and these Back to Africa groups?
Yeah, I mean, as Kellie was saying, definitely anti-slavery groups were much more moderate. A lot of them were like, slavery will end eventually, and we will deal eventually with the end of slavery. We won't do things to help spread slavery across the continent, but let's not get crazy here and go about like abolishing slavery overnight. And abolitionists were like, no, it's a moral evil and it should go away tomorrow. And if we have to take up arms to make that happen, that might be what we need to do, because this is a fundamentally corrupt and immoral and violent system. And until it's gone, the United States is basically constructed on and continuing to live a lie about freedom.
Yeah. A lot of prominent politicians, though, were kind of supporters or at least open to what the ACS was trying to do, including Abraham Lincoln, who I think pretty early on expressed a notion. I mean, I think he's quoted as saying, you know, if it were up to me, I would free slaves and send them all back to Africa. And so I wonder if, I don't know if this is the right way to frame it, but, you know, is there a way of seeing the way that Abraham Lincoln progressed through the slavery question as maybe seeing this as like a gateway drug to abolition? You know, at least it sort of gets you thinking about confronting this problem, and then we see where Lincoln ends up.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about Lincoln saying this in 1854, we haven't had the Dred Scott case yet. We haven't had this idea that Black people aren't citizens. Black people aren't really Americans. And so people are grappling with the idea of colonization because they don't believe that Black Americans are American. So it's part of that. But I think, you know, Lincoln is so heavily praised because he's able to evolve and because someone like Frederick Douglass holds his feet to the fire and says, listen, this is Black people's home. We are not going anywhere. And so Lincoln listens to that. But I think he was just trying to put all options on the table and was open to hearing about what would be the best solution.
And I think it's easy to mistake colonization as sort of the entryway to abolition because of the Lincoln story. But there's also another side of colonization, which is this is a way to continue to shore up slavery and keep it around longer. Because if we solve the problem of free Black people, then we can continue to have slavery and kumbaya from then on after. And so that's colonization is not always, and in fact, I don't think was often a pathway to abolition.
No, totally. Yeah. I think it fits into, what's a several 100-year-long story of an ability to just confront the core evil and the core problem and always sort of talking around the edges and trying to sort of find ways to paper it over. And yeah, this is certainly a very early example of that. Kellie, you know, so much of your work is around political violence and in this era, and certainly I think slave rebellions play into this story.
Yeah, so when you think about Nat Turner's Rebellion in 1831 that takes place in Southampton, Virginia, slave owners across the country are terrified of this being repeated on their plantation in another location. And so they're trying to develop any and all legislation and what they believe will be solutions to curb rebellion. So part of that is to offer free Black people passage, and I can't really say back to, but to Africa, to Liberia. And so the Maryland Colonization Society basically says to free Blacks living in Maryland who are not enslaved, hey, if you want to go to Liberia, we will pay for your passage. They basically say that, like, if you are a free person living in the state, you have X amount of days to get out of the state, or you can face re-enslavement. So Maryland does this, South Carolina does this, Virginia does this. It's incredibly difficult to be a free Black person living in a slave state like North Carolina, for example. So you have a certain amount of time. So you can leave and go further north. You can leave and go to Liberia, or you can stay and risk enslavement.
Such an important story about the precarity of Black freedom. This is something we talked about when we talked about the Fugitive Slave Act, but that idea that wherever you were as a free Black person in the U.S., you weren't actually 100% free, that you always lived with that threat of enslavement.
Mm-hmm.
As we start to wrap up here, I think it's probably worth talking a little bit about Liberia and the sort of legacy of this movement. So from about 1820, when we have this ship that we're talking about today, through the beginning of the Civil War, some 15,000 African Americans settled in Liberia. And we should talk a little bit about that kind of longer legacy. But Niki, you made a slight reference to something that I think is really worth pointing out, which is like, this is a private society here in the United States, basically establishing a colony, even, let's interpret it the most generous way possible, right? Well-intentioned, but nevertheless establishing a colony in Africa, and then sending Black Americans back there. I mean, that is that's a whole nother level of colonialism that I don't think really I had to get my head around.
It's like privatized colonialism,
right.
Which, with all of the problems of nationalist colonialism, it seems like it would have a whole other layer of problems. But I think that it actually leads to the independence of Liberia a lot sooner than it would have had this been a U.S. colony in Africa. Because by 1843, the ACS is like, you all need to declare independence because this is out of our hands now.
Yeah. And they become the second Black independent nation after Haiti, which is quite interesting. And it's leading, political power are Black Americans. And still to this day, Black Americans hold political power and even economic power in Liberia.
Yeah. But does that kind of central identity as a colonial power still kind of, can you still trace that through, Kellie? I mean, for all the Black liberation and other things, I mean, that's hard. It was a colony.
Absolutely. And I think because it was a colony and because that was the structure of it, it's interesting, Black Americans initially brought Bibles, but then after that they brought violence, and they replicated a lot of the same sort of oppression and violence that took place in American slavery and reiterated it in Liberia. And so, I mean, a lot of the tensions and conflicts and wars that Liberia's had remains over this tension between Black Americans who settled the colony and Native Africans who lived in Liberia. And so it's something that still exists today, and you can't really separate the story of colonization, of violence, and the ACS and Black Americans. They're all intertwined together.
And we should say that people descended from Black Americans in Liberia are not a majority of the population. They're a small minority. And so the fact that they still wield political and economic power in this way suggests something about the lasting power of colonialism.
Yeah. 5%.
Yeah, and certainly...
I thought it was really tiny.
And we should find the time to do another segment on the kind of ongoing Back to Africa movement and certainly the revival in the 20th century. And we can get into some of these other things as well because it just continues to complicate the dynamic you were just describing. But let's bring it to an end for this episode, at least with the Mayflower of Liberia. Now, before we go, I do want to do a quick also on this day, because this was the day in 2013. Was it last episode or the episode before we talked about the 13th Amendment and how a number of states, including Mississippi, kind of spaced out and didn't ratify the 13th Amendment for
forgot to turn in the paperwork.
Yeah, forgot to turn in the paperwork. So 2013 on this day was the day that Mississippi finally officially certified the 13th Amendment, becoming the last state to approve the abolition of slavery, or at least the last state that existed when the 13th Amendment was passed. 2013 still blows my mind.
Yeah, it does. It does.
Okay. Let's leave it there. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, listener-supported, artist-owned podcasts. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. Kala Nakua helps with our transcripts. There's a transcript of every episode. You can find a link to that at thisdaypod.com. Thanks to everyone who reaches out with potential topics or questions or comments about the show. We really appreciate it. We read them all. We try and respond to them all or take on all of your suggestions. You can email us thisdaypod@gmail.com. My name is Jody Avergan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
Radiotopia.